A young boy was slowly dying from an incurable disease when, out of nowhere, a raven appeared. What happened next would shock everyone. "You all right, miss?" A shopkeeper's voice cut through the haze of Gemma's thoughts. She blinked, realizing she'd been standing at the vegetable stall for longer than necessary. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Gemma mustered a faint smile, her fingers curling tighter around the frayed strap of her tote bag. "Just distracted," she replied, brushing her dark hair away from her face. The truth was far heavier than she could share with a stranger. Mark's pale, gaunt face haunted her every waking moment. She picked a few wilted carrots and handed them to the shopkeeper without a second glance. It wasn't much, but with Mark barely eating, there wasn't a need for more. As the man wrapped her purchase, Gemma's gaze drifted across the quiet market. The villagers moved with their usual indifference, bundled in coats against the biting wind, their voices muffled under layers of scarves. She envied their normalcy. Her thoughts swirled back to the past week. Mark, her once energetic and curious 10-year-old, had become a shadow of himself. It started with the nosebleeds. Simple, manageable. But soon he was too weak to eat, his voice barely a whisper. The doctors had been useless, their faces masks of helplessness. Painkillers were all they could offer, a bandage on a wound that couldn't heal. "Mom, it hurts," he'd whispered one night, his small hand clutching hers. Gemma's heart had shattered 1,000 times since then. "Ma'am, your carrots." The shopkeeper's voice yanked her back again. She thanked him and tucked the bag into her tote, forcing herself to keep moving. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of her helplessness was pressing her into the frozen ground. She turned the corner, heading toward the last stall she needed to visit. And that's when she saw her. Cindy. Cindy stood by the bakery stall, a scarf wrapped snugly around her neck. She was the kind of woman who seemed impervious to the harshness of life, her cheeks still rosy despite the chill. Gemma stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. It had been years since they'd last seen each other. They'd been friends once, back in high school, before life had taken them in opposite directions. Cindy looked up and their eyes met. Recognition flickered, followed by surprise, then warmth. "Gemma," Cindy called out, her voice carrying easily over the quiet market. Gemma hesitated, a smile tugging at her lips despite the storm inside her. She walked over, each step feeling like stepping onto unsteady ground. "Cindy, it's been a while." "More than a while," Cindy replied with a laugh, pulling her into a hug. "How have you been? You look tired." Tired. The word cut deeper than Cindy could have known. Gemma tried to deflect with a joke, but the lump in her throat wouldn't budge. "It's been a rough year," she admitted instead, her voice low. Cindy's face softened, the kind of look that only old friends could give, understanding without prying. "Let's catch up. The bar's still open, isn't it? You remember our spot?" Gemma nodded, though it felt like a lifetime ago. "Yeah, I remember." The clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversations surrounded them as Gemma slid into the booth across from Cindy. The worn wooden table between them bore the etchings of years past, initials, scribbles, and faint carvings of hearts. Gemma traced one absent-mindedly, the weight of the last year pressing down like a storm cloud over her heart. Cindy rested her elbows on the table, her chin propped in her hands. "It's like nothing's changed in here, huh?" she said with a soft chuckle, her eyes scanning the familiar room. Gemma nodded, her fingers tightening around the edge of her mug. "Except everything has." The words came out heavier than she intended, but Cindy didn't flinch. Instead, She leaned in closer, her voice low and steady. "Tell me about it, Gemma. What's been going on?" For a moment, Gemma hesitated. Talking about it felt like pulling at a thread that might unravel everything holding her together. But Cindy's steady gaze offered a kind of comfort she hadn't felt in months. So she took a deep breath and let the words spill out. "It's Mark," she began, her voice wavering. "He's been sick. Really sick. It started with nosebleeds, but then he stopped eating. He's so weak now, Cindy. The doctors don't know what's wrong with him. They've run every test, tried every treatment. But..." Her voice cracked, and she clutched her mug like it was the only thing grounding her. "He's fading away, and there's nothing I can do." Cindy reached across the table, resting her hand over Gemma's. "I'm so sorry, Gemma. I can't imagine how hard this must be." Gemma swallowed hard, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her. I don't know how to help him. Every day I watch him get worse, and I feel like I'm failing him. Like I'm just waiting for..." She couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. Cindy squeezed her hand gently, her voice soft but firm. "You're not failing him. You're doing everything you can." Gemma shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It's not enough." For a while, neither of them spoke. The bar buzzed with distant laughter and clinking glasses, but their corner felt like a world of its own, quiet and heavy with unspoken fears. Finally, Cindy broke the silence. "Listen, I don't know if this will help, but there's someone I think you should meet." Gemma looked up, her brows knitting together. "What do you mean?" "My husband's grandmother," Cindy said, her voice careful. "She lives out in the forest. People in his village call her healer, like old-school remedies and stuff. She's helped a lot of people with strange illnesses." Gemma blinked, unsure how to respond. "A healer? Cindy, that sounds... I don't know." "I get it," Cindy interrupted, holding up a hand. "It sounds far-fetched, but Gemma, she's the real deal. People say she knows things. Stuff doctors don't. If anyone can help Mark, it might be her." Gemma hesitated, her mind a tangle of doubt and desperation. "I don't know, Cindy. It feels more. What do you have to lose?" Cindy's voice was gentle but insistent. "If there's even a chance she can help, isn't it worth a try?" The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Gemma looked down at her mug, her reflection rippling in the dark liquid. What did she have to lose? Mark was slipping through her fingers, and every traditional avenue had failed them. Maybe this was her last chance. 2 weeks later, Gemma sat in her small living room, nervously fidgeting with the edge of her sweater. Cindy was due any minute, and despite her initial skepticism, Gemma had agreed to meet the healer. The memory of their conversation in the bar still echoed in her mind, each word feeding the fragile hope she clung to. The knock at the door startled her, and she hurried to open it. Cindy stood on the porch, bundled against the cold, a determined look in her eyes. "Ready?" she asked, stepping inside and shaking off the chill. "As ready as I'll ever be," Gemma replied, her voice steadier than she felt. They sat down at the kitchen table, and Cindy wasted no time diving into the details. I told her about Mark, about his symptoms. She recognized them right away. Gemma's heart skipped a beat. "She did?" Cindy nodded. "She said it's something she's seen before, a long time ago. A kind of parasite, she thinks." "Parasite?" Gemma's stomach churned at the thought. How could he have gotten something like that? Cindy shrugged, her expression serious. She didn't say, but she did say, there's a cure. Gemma leaned forward, her breath catching. What is it? There's a flower, Cindy explained. She called it a flaming lily. It only grows on volcanic rock. That's what she used to treat it before. Volcanic rock? Gemma's hope faltered. Where am I supposed to find something like that? Cindy hesitated, her tone cautious. She said, it's dangerous, Gemma. The flower grows in the lava beds of a dormant volcano near the edge of the state. It's not an easy place to get to. Gemma's mind reeled. The idea of trekking to a volcano, of finding this flower in such a perilous place. It felt impossible. But as she thought of Mark, lying weak and pale in his bed, the impossibility of it all seemed irrelevant. What do I need to do? She asked finally, her voice firm, despite the fear creeping into her chest. Cindy reached out, squeezing her hand. First we go see her. She can explain more. One step at a time, okay? The drive stretched long into the afternoon, and with each passing mile, the landscape grew quieter. Trees clustered closer together, their branches intertwining overhead, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced on the dirt road. Gemma gripped the wheel, her knuckles pale against the dull, grey interior of the car. Cindy sat beside her, glancing occasionally at the map on her phone, while Gemma's younger sister, Claire, held a sleeping Mark in the back seat. The air inside the car was heavy, not from silence, but from the unspoken fear that clung to them all. When the road narrowed to little more than a trail, Gemma stopped the car. "This is it?" she asked, her voice tight with doubt. The forest ahead seemed to swallow what little sunlight remained, leaving an eerie, green-tinged gloom that made her stomach churn. Cindy nodded. "From here, we walk. It's not far." Gemma turned in her seat to check on Mark. He looked impossibly fragile, his face pale and drawn. Even in sleep, his small chest rose and fell with the shallow breaths of someone fighting to stay alive. She swallowed hard and climbed out of the car. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees pressing close as if the world was trying to fold in on itself. Every snap of a twig underfoot made Gemma flinch, her nerves stretched thin by the oppressive quiet. The chill in the air seemed to seep into her bones, each step feeling heavier than the last. And then they saw it. The house emerged from the shadows like something out of a half-forgotten tale, its crooked roof slanting against the sky. The wood was dark with age, and moss crept up the sides as though nature itself was trying to reclaim it. A single window, dimly lit from within, cast a faint glow onto the tangle of ivy and overgrown shrubs surrounding the structure. Gemma hesitated, her feet rooted to the spot. This feels wrong," she murmured, barely audible. Cindy glanced at her, a reassuring smile flickering across her face. "She's not what you think. Just trust me, okay?" Claire, who had been silent the entire walk, shifted Mark's weight in her arms and gave Gemma a determined look. "If there's even a chance, we have to try." Gemma nodded, though the knot in her stomach tightened. The door creaked open before they could knock, revealing a figure shrouded in layers of wool and cloth. The old woman was smaller than Gemma had imagined, her frame slight but straight, her presence both commanding and unsettling. Her eyes, sharp and dark, seemed to pierce through the gloom, locking onto Gemma first and then drifting to Mark. "Bring him in," the woman said, her voice gravelly but firm. She stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The interior was as cluttered and peculiar as Gemma had feared. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with jars of herbs, dried flowers, and unidentifiable things floating in murky liquid. A small fire crackled in a stone hearth, the only source of warmth in the room. Claire gently laid Mark on a low cot near the fire, brushing his hair back from his forehead. The boy stirred but didn't wake, his breathing faint. The old woman knelt beside him, her movements precise and unhurried. She reached for a small pouch at her waist, sprinkling a pinch of something that smelled faintly of mint over Mark's chest. Then she closed her eyes and pressed her hands gently to his temples. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of the wind outside. When the old woman finally spoke, her words carried the weight of certainty. "It's as I thought," she said, sitting back on her heels. "The boy's been taken by a parasite, a rare one, ancient. It feeds slowly, hollowing out the body until there's nothing left but skin and bone." Gemma felt the air leave her lungs. "Can you cure him?" she asked, her voice trembling. The old woman's gaze softened, though her expression remained serious. "There's a cure," she said, "but it's no simple remedy." She stood, crossing the room to one of the shelves. From a high corner, she retrieved a weathered book, its spine cracked and pages brittle. Flipping through it, she stopped at a page with a faded sketch of a flower, its petals sharp and fiery, like tongues of flame. "This is what you need," the woman said, holding the book up for Gemma to see. "The flaming lily. Its extract will kill the parasite and heal the boy, but what?" Gemma's voice was barely above a whisper. The old woman closed the book, cradling it in her hands. "The flower only grows on lava, not near volcanoes or on their slopes, on the lava itself. It thrives in the heat, and without it, the flower wilts and dies in minutes." Gemma's heart sank. That sounds impossible. The woman's dark eyes met hers. "It's not impossible, but it's close. Few who have sought the flower have returned." Silence fell over the room as the weight of her words settled on them all. Gemma's hands trembled as she looked at Mark, so small and helpless on the cot. She thought of his laughter, his endless questions, the way he used to run barefoot through the fields. "Is there no other way?" she asked, her voice breaking. The old woman shook her head. "If there were, I would tell you. But the choice is yours. Risk everything to save him, or—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Gemma closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down like a boulder. She had come so far, clinging to hope by a thread. Could she truly give up now? When she opened her eyes, they were brimming with tears, but her voice was steady. "Tell me what I need to do." Gemma's footsteps felt heavy as they left the old woman's house, her heart weighed down by the impossible task ahead. Mark rested limp in her arms, his shallow breaths a quiet reminder of the time slipping away. Cindy walked beside her in silence, the enormity of the challenge keeping any words at bay. The forest seemed darker now, its branches tangled like the thoughts racing through Gemma's mind. By the time they reached the car, the air felt colder, and Gemma hesitated before setting Mark into the back seat. She tucked a blanket around him and paused, staring at his small, pale face. How could she risk this? How could she not? As she slid into the driver's seat, Cindy spoke up for the first time. "We'll figure it out, Gemma, one way or another." But Gemma wasn't listening. Her focus was on Mark, who stirred weakly, his voice barely audible as he whispered, "Mom." She turned in her seat, leaning closer. "I'm here, baby. What is it?" Mark's lips trembled as he tried to speak again, his eyes fluttering open. "The Raven. Call him." Gemma blinked, startled. "What? Mark? What are you talking about?" Mark's gaze locked onto hers, a flicker of determination breaking through his exhaustion. The raven, the one I helped. The memory hit her like a sudden gust of wind. She had almost forgotten. Months ago, no, nearly a year, Mark had found an injured raven in the snow. She had scolded him for bringing it home, warned him about diseases and the mess it would make. But Mark had been insistent, his small hands carefully wrapping the bird's broken leg with tape and his mother's ointment. "Mom, I can't just leave it there," Mark had pleaded, standing in the doorway with the trembling bird tucked under his jacket. "It'll die," she'd sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Fine. One night, Mark. One. And keep it out of sight." Mark had nodded eagerly, his face alight with triumph. Over the following weeks, the bird became his constant companion. It couldn't fly at first, so Mark built a little pen for it in an old shoebox, feeding it bits of bread and scraps from the kitchen. Slowly, its strength returned, and so did its instincts. Gemma remembered the day she had walked into his room and found the raven perched on his desk, its black eyes gleaming as it tilted its head at her. She had screamed, startling both Mark and the bird. "It's time for it to go, Mark," she had insisted. Reluctantly, he had let the raven out, but not without a parting gift. He'd bought a small whistle with his allowance and spent hours training the bird to return whenever he blew it. After that, the raven became more than a pet. It became his friend, returning often to perch on the fence or hop along beside him as he played outside. Now, in the car, Gemma stared at Mark in disbelief. "You think the raven can help?" "Mark, it's just a bird." But Mark shook his head weakly. "He'll come. He always does. Please, Mom, blow the whistle." Her first instinct was to argue, to tell him that they couldn't waste time on such fantasies. But the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't just a plea. It was a quiet, desperate belief that his friend would come. Gemma fumbled in her bag, pulling out the small whistle that Mark had insisted on keeping, even when he was too sick to use it. Stepping out of the car, she hesitated for a moment, then brought the whistle to her lips and blew. The sound was sharp, cutting through the stillness of the forest. It echoed once, twice, before fading into silence. Gemma lowered the whistle, her breath visible in the cold air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, in the distance, the faint flutter of wings broke the quiet. Gemma squinted, her heart thudding as a dark shape emerged from the trees, growing larger with each beat of its wings. The raven landed on the hood of the car, its black feathers glossy against the dull grey metal. It tilted its head at Gemma, then at the whistle in her hand, as if understanding why it had been summoned. "Mark," Gemma whispered, turning back to the car. "He's here." Mark's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Show him." "The flower," he murmured. Gemma hesitated, then pulled out the sketch the old woman had given her. She unfolded it carefully and held it up to the raven. "This," she said softly. "Can you find this?" The raven stared at the drawing, its head tilting again, almost as if studying it. Then, without warning, it let out a low caw and snatched the paper in its beak. Gemma gasped, stepping back as the bird took off, disappearing into the canopy above. She stared after it, her heart pounding. Cindy stepped beside her. Do you think it'll come back?" Gemma hugged herself, her eyes still on the empty sky. "I don't know," she admitted. "But Mark does. And right now, that's enough for me." The raven's wings beat steadily against the night air, each stroke carrying it further from the safety of the forest and closer to the impossible task ahead. Below, the trees thinned into barren plains, and the world grew colder, quieter, as if it too held its breath for what lay ahead. In its beak, the sketch of the flaming lily fluttered faintly, a fragile guide in the vast emptiness. The raven knew the journey well, or at least the direction. Somewhere in its sharp, instinctual mind, it understood what was at stake. The boy who had nursed it back to health, who had patched its broken limb and fed it crumbs from his small, gentle hands, he needed it now. The bond they had forged in those quiet moments of care gave purpose to each beat of its wings. Hours passed, the moon rising high overhead, casting a pale glow over the desolate expanse below. The raven soared tirelessly, its sharp eyes scanning the horizon. And then it saw it, a faint red glow against the darkened sky. The volcano loomed like a silent giant, its edges jagged and its peak wreathed in a thin veil of smoke. The air grew warmer as the raven approached, each gust of wind carrying the acrid tang of sulfur. The once distant glow intensified, illuminating the cracked, blackened earth that surrounded the volcano's base. But the raven did not falter. It descended in tight spirals, its feathers ruffled by the rising heat, until it reached the rim of the crater. The volcano's mouth was vast and unyielding, a cauldron of molten rock that hissed and bubbled like a living thing. The heat was nearly unbearable, radiating in waves that distorted the air and blurred the raven's vision. It perched briefly on a jagged rock at the edge, tilting its head as it surveyed the scene below. There, growing defiantly among the glowing cracks of lava, were the flaming lilies. They were unlike anything the raven had seen before, their petals a vivid red-orange that seemed to flicker like fire. Each bloom stood tall and proud, their stems rooted precariously in the harsh, unforgiving terrain. But the raven could sense the danger. The lilies thrived in this environment, but everything else, the heat, the fumes, the unstable ground, was deadly. With a low caw, the raven launched itself into the air, hovering briefly as it calculated its approach. The lilies were scattered across the lava beds, their placement random and unpredictable. It couldn't afford to waste time, nor could it risk damaging the fragile flowers. Slowly, carefully, the raven descended, landing lightly on a narrow outcrop near the closest lily. The heat was suffocating. Every breath felt like inhaling fire, and the rock beneath the raven's claws burned with an intensity that threatened to sear through its hardened skin. But it didn't waver. With precise movements, it leaned forward, grasping the stem of the lily in its beak. The stem gave way with a soft snap, the flower now safely secured. One down. The raven took off again, weaving through the swirling heat and noxious fumes, its keen eyes locking onto the next bloom. Each landing was more treacherous than the last, the rocks shifting unpredictably under its weight. Twice, the raven had to retreat as the ground gave way, sending chunks of molten stone crashing into the lava below. It worked tirelessly, flower by flower, until it had gathered a small bouquet of flaming lilies. The stems were delicate, and the flowers themselves seemed to pulse faintly with the heat they absorbed. The raven clutched them carefully in its beak, knowing that even the slightest mishap could ruin everything. The journey back to the crater's rim was even more harrowing. The added weight of the lilies made the raven's flight slower, its wings straining against the oppressive heat. But it pressed on, driven by an unshakable determination. When it finally reached the edge, it paused to catch its breath, the lilies trembling slightly in its beak. Below, the lava churned and hissed, as if mocking the creature that had dared to defy its domain. The raven didn't look back. With a powerful thrust of its wings, it launched itself into the cooler air above, the weight of the lilies a reminder of the fragile life waiting for its return. The journey back was no less grueling. The raven's wings ached with exhaustion, its body pushed to the limits of endurance. But the memory of Mark's small, trusting smile spurred it onward. Dawn began to break as the raven neared the forest, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the shadows. Gemma and Cindy stood by the car, their faces etched with worry. They had waited through the long, cold night, their hope dwindling with each passing hour. And then they saw it. A dark speck against the pale morning sky, growing larger with every beat of its wings. Gemma's breath caught in her throat, her hand flying to her mouth. The raven landed with a heavy thud on the hood of the car, its wings splayed out, feathers trembling with exhaustion. Gemma rushed forward, her heart pounding as she reached out to the bird. In its beak, impossibly delicate yet glowing with an inner fire, was the bouquet of flaming lilies. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she carefully took the flowers. The petals were warm to the touch, their fiery hues almost too vibrant to be real. "You did it," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. The raven let out a faint caw before collapsing, its small body spent from the harrowing journey. "Cindy, take care of him," Gemma said, her voice firm despite the emotion cracking through it. Cindy gently lifted the bird, cradling it in her hands. Gemma turned her attention to Mark. He lay pale and still in the back seat, his breathing faint but steady. She glanced at the flowers in her hand, feeling the weight of their importance, then turned toward the car. The old woman was waiting when they arrived, standing at the door of her small, crooked house. Her sharp eyes flicked to the bouquet of lilies in Gemma's hands, and she gave a slight nod of approval. "Bring them in," she said briskly, stepping aside. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of herbs and smoke, the fireplace crackling softly in the corner. The old woman wasted no time. She cleared a space on her work table, spreading out tools and vials with practiced efficiency. "Set the boy down near the fire," she instructed. "He needs to stay warm." Gemma obeyed, laying Mark on the cot they had used before. She smoothed his hair back, her fingers lingering on his clammy forehead. "He's so weak," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. The old woman didn't respond, her focus entirely on the flowers. She worked methodically, removing each petal with steady hands and placing them in a stone bowl. A mortar and pestle were brought out, the petals crushed into a glowing paste that shimmered like molten gold. Gemma watched, her heart pounding with every movement. The minutes stretched into hours, the process slow and painstaking. The old woman boiled water over the fire, adding the paste and stirring it with a wooden spoon carved with intricate symbols. The room filled with a faintly sweet, almost otherworldly aroma that made Gemma's chest tighten with both fear and hope. Cindy sat in the corner, the raven nestled in her lap. It stirred occasionally, letting out soft, tired caws as if urging the old woman to hurry. Gemma couldn't sit still. She paced the small room, glancing repeatedly at the bubbling mixture in the pot. "Is it ready yet?" she asked, her voice taut with anxiety. "Patience," the old woman replied without looking up. "This is not a process that can be rushed." Gemma bit her lip, forcing herself to stay quiet. But the minutes felt like hours, each one stretching unbearably as she glanced back at Mark. His small chest rose and fell so faintly it was almost imperceptible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the old woman lifted the pot from the fire and poured the liquid into a small glass vial. The golden liquid shimmered as she capped the vial, her expression unreadable as she turned to Gemma. "This is it," she said, holding out the vial. "It will either work, or it won't." Gemma's hands shook as she took the vial. Her throat tightened, and she glanced at Mark, who lay unmoving on the cot. "He'll make it," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "He has to." The old woman nodded toward Mark. "Lift his head, slowly." Gemma knelt by her son, her heart pounding as she gently lifted his head. She uncapped the vial, the scent of the golden liquid faintly sweet and sharp. With trembling hands, she brought the vial to Mark's lips, tilting it just enough for the liquid to slip into his mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Gemma held her breath, her gaze locked on Mark's face. Then, slowly, his chest rose with a deeper breath than she had seen in days. His eyelids fluttered, a faint color returning to his pale cheeks. "Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then finding her face. "Mom," he croaked, his voice barely audible. Gemma's sob of relief filled the room. "Oh, baby," she whispered, pulling him close. "You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay." The old woman stood back, watching silently as Gemma clung to her son. Cindy smiled softly from her corner, the raven stirring in her lap as if sensing the boy's recovery. Over the next few hours, Mark grew stronger. He was still weak, but the trembling in his hands subsided, and his voice, though hoarse, gained strength. Gemma couldn't stop staring at him, her heart swelling with a hope she hadn't dared to feel in weeks. "Thank you," she said to the old woman, her voice thick with gratitude. The old woman waved a hand dismissively. "Thank the raven," she said, nodding toward the bird. "Without it, there would be no cure." Gemma turned to the raven, which blinked up at her with tired, intelligent eyes. She crossed the room, kneeling in front of Cindy and the bird. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. The raven tilted its head, letting out a low, soft caw. Mark's first steps were hesitant, shaky, like a fawn finding its legs for the first time. Gemma held her breath, her hands hovering near his sides, ready to steady him if he faltered. But the boy surprised them all. With a determined glint in his eye, he pushed forward one step, then another, until he reached the edge of the small clearing outside the old woman's house. Cindy clapped softly, and the raven let out a sharp caw from its perch on a low branch, as though cheering him on. Gemma pressed her hands to her chest, tears brimming in her eyes. It wasn't just that Mark was walking, it was the light in his face, the life that had seemed so far out of reach only days ago. "Mum, I'm fine," Mark said, turning to her with a sheepish smile. His voice was still hoarse, but it carried a warmth that made Gemma's heart swell. "I know, sweetheart," she replied, her voice trembling. I can't believe it." The days that followed were like a dream. Each morning, Gemma woke to find Mark stronger than the day before. He could sit up without effort, his appetite returned, and the hollowness in his cheeks began to fill out. Every small victory felt monumental. The raven, ever watchful, became Mark's constant companion. It perched on the back of his chair during meals, its sharp eyes following every movement, or hopped along beside him as he ventured farther into the yard each day. They were inseparable, and Gemma found herself marveling at the bond between them. "Raven," Mark would call, holding up a stick or a small stone. The bird would respond with a caw, darting down to snatch the object from his hand, only to return it moments later like a well-trained dog. One afternoon, as Gemma watched from the kitchen window, Mark sat cross-legged in the grass, sketching something in the dirt with a stick. The raven stood nearby, cocking its head curiously at the drawings. Gemma couldn't hear their conversation, But the sound of Mark's laughter drifted through the open window, and, for the first time in months, she felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. The transformation in Gemma was just as profound. At first, she had regarded the raven with cautious gratitude, unsure how to reconcile the bird's extraordinary role in saving her son's life. But as she watched the creature interact with Mark, her wariness melted into something deeper. One evening, she found herself sitting on the porch, the raven perched on the railing beside her. She stared out at the horizon, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped low. "You're more than just a bird, aren't you?" she said softly, not expecting a reply. The raven tilted its head, its black eyes reflecting the fading light. Gemma smiled faintly. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything." The raven ruffled its feathers, letting out a soft caw that felt almost like an acknowledgement. Life began to settle into a rhythm again, but it wasn't the same as before. It was better. Gemma found herself savoring the small moments. Mark's laughter, the way the raven hopped after him like a loyal shadow, the quiet evenings spent together as a family. Cindy stayed with them for a few days before returning home, but not before hugging Gemma tightly. "You've got something special here," she said, nodding toward Mark and the raven who were playing in the yard. "I know," Gemma replied, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'm not going to take it for granted." The raven had become more than a hero. It was part of their family now, a reminder of the resilience and love that had carried them through their darkest days. One afternoon, as the sun hung high in the sky, Mark called out to his mother from the yard. "Mom, look at this!" Gemma stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the sunlight. Mark was holding a small wooden whistle, the same one he had used to call the raven. "Watch," he said, grinning. He raised the whistle to his lips and blew a short, sharp note. The raven, perched on a nearby fence post, let out a loud caw and swooped down, landing gracefully on Mark's shoulder. The boy laughed, his eyes sparkling with joy. Gemma leaned against the doorframe, her heart full. "He really loves you, doesn't he?" she said, smiling at her son. Mark nodded, reaching up to gently stroke the bird's glossy feathers. "He's my best friend, Mom." Gemma didn't argue. She simply watched, knowing that in some inexplicable way, the raven understood more than it ever could as an ordinary bird. The old woman's warning lingered in her mind sometimes, a quiet whisper that tempered her joy with a reminder of how close they had come to losing it all. But Gemma chose not to dwell on the past. Instead, she focused on the present, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sound of Mark's laughter, the raven's soft caws as it played alongside her son. They had been through a storm, but now, finally, the skies had cleared. And as Gemma stood there watching Mark and the raven chase each other across the yard, she realized something. Hope wasn't something you found. It was something you held on to, even in the darkest of times. And sometimes, if you held on long enough, it came back to you in ways you never expected. The story of the raven and Mark is a deeply touching journey that highlights the resilience of the human and animal spirit, and the profound bonds that transcend words. Mark's struggle against an insurmountable illness, paired with Gemma's unwavering love as a mother, forms the emotional core of this tale. Their journey is not just about survival, it's about rediscovering hope in the darkest times. What makes this story truly remarkable is the raven's selfless devotion. It is not merely a bird, but a silent hero, risking its life to save the boy who once saved it. Its actions remind us that loyalty and gratitude are not confined to humans. They are universal virtues that can inspire extraordinary acts of bravery. The journey teaches us a timeless lesson about love, sacrifice, and hope. Gemma's determination to save her son, despite overwhelming odds, mirrors the strength we all have when fighting for those we love. The raven's journey symbolizes how small acts of kindness can ripple into life-saving moments. Ultimately, the story reminds us that miracles often come in unexpected forms, and even the smallest beings can teach us the deepest lessons about compassion, resilience, and the beauty of giving without expecting anything in return. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.